All right, let's get started. Today we're tackling a question about the first peoples of Los Angeles that, on the surface, feels like it should have an easy answer, but as you're about to see, it's a real historical puzzle. This is going to be fascinating.
So, right off the bat, what do they call themselves? Well, the short answer is, there isn't one. Seriously, before Europeans ever arrived, the people living in the LA Basin just didn't see themselves as one big, unified tribe. To really get a handle on who they were, we have to kind of step back and see the world the way they did.
So where do we even begin? Well, we have to go back, way back, before any outsiders showed up. The foundational clue here isn't some big, sweeping tribal name. Nope, it's something much, much more personal and local.
And this, right here, is the absolute key to the whole thing. The very concept of a single tribal name for everyone, it was a totally foreign idea. That's something that was going to be brought in from the outside later on. For them, their entire world, their whole sense of self, was defined by something way closer to home. So think about it like this. Your identity was totally hyper-local. You belonged to your specific village, which the Spanish later called a rancheria. So if you walked up to someone back then and asked, "Who are you?" they wouldn't say, "I'm from the XYZ tribe." No way. They'd tell you they were from Yangna, which is basically where downtown LA is today, or from Sibagna, over near where San Gabriel is now. Their world wasn't one big nation. It was this incredible network of distinct communities.
So what happened? What changed all this? Well, the arrival of Spanish missionaries completely flipped the script. They brought with them a totally new way of classifying people, a system where names weren't chosen by the people themselves, but were just given to them. And there's actually a word for this, a really important one for our story. It's exonym. An exonym is just a name that outsiders give to a group of people. And that is exactly what happened in the LA Basin. The Spanish showed up, and for their own bureaucratic administrative reasons, they needed a simple way to label everybody. And in doing that, their method just steamrolled over centuries of these really specific local identities.
So here's the play-by-play. The Spanish set up the Mission San Gabriel, right? And pretty quickly, they realized they needed a simple catch-all term for all the different indigenous people they were interacting with around that mission. So what did they do? They just called them Gabrielinos, literally, the people from the San Gabriel mission. And just like that, with one stroke of a pen, a bureaucratic label starts to erase all those distinct village identities like Yana and Sabagya. Everybody just gets lumped together into this one big colonial box. And for literally centuries, that name, Gabrielino, was pretty much the only name you'd find in the official records. But things have been changing. More recently, a really powerful movement has grown among descendants to try and reclaim an autonym. That's the opposite of an exonym. It's a name a group uses for itself. And that search has sparked this incredible deep dive back into a really fragmented historical record. Okay, so this timeline really lays it all out for us. You can see a really critical pattern emerge. Look, before 1769, you've got the original village names, Yangna, Sibagana. Then, right as the Spanish arrive, we see this brief mention of something like Quincherino. But then, look at this gap. For more than 100 years, the colonial name Gabrielino just takes over. It completely dominates the record. And it's not until way later, 1903, that the name Tongva shows up for the very first and only time in any historical document. And this brings us right to the heart of the modern debate. It really boils down to two main contenders for an ancestral name, Tongva and Kizh. But here's the thing, they have radically different paper trails. The name Tongva comes from a single recording made one time in 1903. That's it. Kizh, on the other hand, shows up in different forms in much earlier records, and it seems to be connected to the native word for house. All right, let's really dig into the evidence here, side by side. The entire case for Tongva rests on that one set of field notes from 1903. There's just no other support for it in earlier records. Now, the case for Kizh, which comes from the word for house, it definitely looks stronger on paper, historically speaking. It's in those early Spanish records. But, and this is a huge but, was Kizh a name for all the people, or was it maybe just the name of a specific village right by the mission? That's the million-dollar question. You know, this might seem like just an academic debate about history, but it is so much more than that. This question, what to call the ancestral people of Los Angeles, it has incredibly real consequences right now, today. We're talking about things like federal tribal recognition, efforts to revitalize culture and language, and even just how we remember and honor this history in public spaces. And here's a perfect real-world example of just how tricky this is. Just a few years ago, back in 2017, the city of Pomona wanted to put up a plaque to honor the local indigenous people. A great idea, right? But the different descendant groups couldn't agree on a name. Some wanted Tongva, others insisted on Kizh. And in the end, what was the compromise? You're not going to believe this. They settled on Gabrielino, the old colonial name. It was seen as the only neutral term they could all agree on. Isn't that wild?
So where does that leave us? Let's recap what our investigation has turned up. First, there was no single big-picture name before the Europeans arrived. Your identity was your village. Simple as that. Second, Gabrielino was a colonial label, an exonym, which has now, ironically, become a kind of neutral middle ground for some. And finally, both Tongva and Kizh, as powerful as they are for reclaiming identity today, are basically modern reconstructions built on really contested and shaky historical evidence.
And all of this leaves us with a much bigger, more profound question to chew on. If a name can be given by outsiders, then lost to history, and then pieced back together from just a few fragments, what does that really tell us about what identity even is? It makes you wonder, right? How does a people's story, their very existence, manage to endure even when their own name for themselves gets lost along the way?